But here's something interesting. During the midst of this whole Jeep thing, the Willys company figured that, hey, you know how this is successful in the military? What if we made a civilian version? It found that the need for a civilian edition of the Jeep was really, really good. It was in high demand because it was one of the best cars you could get. So, in 1943, the Willys company began making civilian Jeeps. So the civilian Jeep brand came into dealerships, or whatever the 1930s, 1940s equivalent of dealerships were throughout America, and it was pretty popular. And even after the military Jeeps ended, these ones kept going along. And now, if you're wondering why it was called a Jeep, let me explain. So you may know that America likes to shorten absolutely everything. We like to simplify things. And a great example of this would be the American military, which would shorten every possible thing it could find, to make radio communication a lot easier. So what they did was shorten this name, Ford GPW. Eventually, that became shortened to the name Jeep. And from that point onwards, the term Jeep would be used to describe not just the Willys MB and Ford GPW, but any military vehicle like it. So this just shows how much influence the car actually had. Now, this Jeep name was officially trademarked by the Willys Company around the 1943 mark, and they began selling these for the civilians. Of course, they removed all the totally obviously military parts of it and made it a civilian car. The utility truck Jeep came along, and it was really, really successful. That is until the fact that Willys, once the war ended, decided that they weren't going to make any of the passenger cars that had brought them to success years earlier. So this meant that all they were selling was Jeeps, Jeeps, and Jeeps. And oh, did I forget? They also sold Jeeps! Every single thing they sold was a Jeep or a variant of a Jeep. They made this thing called the Jeepster, and it's pretty much everything was a Jeep around the company. But eventually, in the 1952, they decided to come back to the passenger car market by introducing the Willys Aero, and it was a massive disappointment. The Willys company shut down 1 year later and was bought by a new company called Kaiser. Now, as a result of this, Willys was gone. And despite having created one of the most popular military vehicles ever made, they went down because the Willys Aero was a massive flop. And so this means that Willys was later bought by the Kaiser company. And they started going about with Jeeps as well until they too began going a little bit faltering here and there, and eventually they were bought by a much larger company named American Motors, or AM for short. Now, AM was one of the largest motoring companies at the time in America, and so it turned out that the Jeep helped massively boost their portfolio as the Jeep began to become so much more successful, and more people found it more lucrative, which means more sales and more Jeeps, which is what we want, and it's what American Motors wanted. But meanwhile, something interesting was going on. Now, in the 1970s, a little French company called Renault was coming along, found American Motors, and decided that it would do whatever it took to run that company and get the Jeep. And of course, all the other American Motors brands, which were equally popular, but Jeep was it. It was so successful, and everyone wanted a Jeep. And companies wanted the Jeep brand. So what was going on was Renault was slowly getting more and more of a stake in the company, and eventually it went all the way to the point where Renault had so much of a controlling stake that they themselves could start selling all of these Jeeps. And so it pretty much came to the point where Renault almost owned the company in full. But then another company, this time it's an American car company that you all may have also heard of, Chrysler, comes along. Chrysler comes back and manages to take most of American Motors, and eventually Chrysler acquires American Motors in 1988. And by this point, American Motors fell under Chrysler's control, which means that Chrysler ran Jeep, which was like the big thing. Now, of course, Chrysler was immensely popular already, and with its other brands like Dodge and Ram, it was an instant hit. But now with Jeep under its portfolio, it became super popular. Everyone still wanted a Jeep, and so as Jeeps kept going along, Chrysler kept making these Jeeps, the civilian Jeeps. And by this time, the need for a Jeep in the military sense was long gone. They'd already replaced it with a different one that was later known as the Humvee, but that's a different story for another time. Now the Jeep right here, the Jeep was still, the civilian form was still the biggest thing there. Eventually, around like the 2010s or so, Chrysler, well, they kept going on with Jeep. Eventually, Chrysler merged with the company Fiat around the 2010, and eventually they became FCA Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. And a little while later, they merged with another company called PSA Group, which is actually French. And this actually happened in like literally this year. These two companies merged to form Stellantis. And now Stellantis itself is the company that currently runs Jeep, the famed civilian car brand that everyone loves. That is why the Jeep has come to how it is today. That's why Jeep is called that way, and that is the history of one of the greatest American car brands of all time, Jeep. Thanks so much for watching, and see you soon. Love you, Akash.